My sister looked at the blisters on my arms, laughed, and told the entire family that I was nothing but a peasant who smelled like yeast. She screamed that I was just a baker, while she was a high society visionary. She didn't realize that those burns were from the private oven of the royal consulate. She didn't know that the baker she was mocking is the only person the crown prince will talk to, and she certainly didn't know that the 50 million investment she's begging for tonight is sitting in a bank account that only my fingerprint can open. She wanted me to feel the heat of her anger. She's about to find out that if you can't stand the heat, you shouldn't have tried to burn the person who owns the kitchen. The kitchen was a surgical strike of heat and chaos, the air thick with the scent of caramelized sugar and the metallic tang of a long night. I stood by the cooling rack, my breath coming in shallow hitches as the medical shock of the burns on my forearms began to throb in rhythm with my heartbeat. I had been awake for 22 hours, hand laminating 1,000 layers of dough for the most important gala of the decade. One slip of the tray, one ghost moment of exhaustion, and the scalding sugar had splashed across my skin. But I hadn't stopped. I couldn't stop. The resolution of my career depended on this single night. Then, the door swung open with a violent status flip. My sister, Sarah, marched in, looking like a social mask of perfection in her $3,000 silk gown. She didn't look at the trays of perfect golden pastries. She didn't look at my exhausted face. She looked at the clock and then she looked at the red, raw skin on my arms with a sneer of pure glow arrogance. "You're behind schedule," she screamed, her voice a surgical strike that shattered the quiet hum of the industrial fans. "The board members are already arriving at the ballroom. The prince's envoy is expecting the dessert service in 30 minutes. And you're standing here looking like a janitor who lost a fight with a toaster." "Sarah, I had an accident," I whispered, my voice cracked from the heat. I tried to show her the medical shock of my injuries, the blisters already beginning to weep against the white fabric of my chef's coat. The sugar hit me. "I just need 5 minutes to bandage this, and then I'll—" 5 minutes? She stepped closer, her face twisting into a mask of permanent foreclosure for any empathy she might have once possessed. "Do you have any idea what's at stake tonight? This gala is my vantage point. If the catering isn't perfect, my reputation in this city is dead. And you're crying over a few scratches? You really are pathetic, Maya. You've always been the ghost of this family, hiding in the flour and the grease, because you don't have the stomach for real power." She grabbed a plate of delicate macarons and threw them toward the trash bin, the porcelain shattering with a sound like a surgical strike. "You're just a baker. Do you understand that? You're a servant with a rolling pin, while I'm out there making the deals that keep this family in the glow of high society. You're in here sweating like a common laborer. Don't you dare ruin my night with your peasant problems." The mirror paradox of the moment was almost too much to bear. She stood there, the powerful boss of a PR firm that was secretly 6 months behind on its office rent, screaming at the woman who was secretly the primary shareholder of the very venue she was standing in. She saw the burns as a sign of my low-class failure. She didn't see them as the scars of a sovereign who had personally overseen the most exclusive pastry kitchen in the world. I looked down at my arms, then back at her. The tears were there, yes. The pain was a medical shock that couldn't be ignored, but behind the tears, a cold resolution was beginning to form. I didn't scream back. I didn't defend my work. I just looked at her with a smile that made her flinch for a split second. "You're right, Sarah," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous ghost of a whisper. "I am just a baker, and tonight, I'm going to make sure everyone at that table gets exactly what they've earned. I'll bring the desserts out myself. I wouldn't want to miss the glow on your face when the prince tastes what I've prepared for him." "You'd better," she snapped, turning on her heel and leaving a trail of expensive perfume in her wake. "And put some sleeves on. Nobody wants to see your janitor scars while they're trying to eat." I waited until the door clicked shut. Then I reached for my phone and dialed a private encrypted number. "This is the architect," I said to the voice on the other end. "Change the seating chart. I want to be served at the head table. And tell the prince his mentor is ready to show him the final lesson in status flip." The grand ballroom was a surgical strike of opulence, a sea of black ties and silk gowns that shimmered under the weight of 3-tier crystal chandeliers. This was the glow Sarah had spent her entire life chasing, the pinnacle of high Society where reputations were forged or shattered over a single glass of vintage champagne. Sarah moved through the crowd like a powerful boss, her social mask perfectly calibrated to project an image of effortless success. She whispered in the ears of billionaires and laughed at the jokes of ambassadors, all while keeping a desperate eye on the kitchen doors. To the elite, she was the visionary who had curated this entire evening. To me, she was a ghost inhabiting a life she couldn't afford. I stood behind the velvet curtains of the service entrance, my breath hitching as the medical shock of the burns on my arms pulsed under the thin lace sleeves I had used to cover the damage. I had traded my chef's whites for a deep emerald gown that matched the vantage of the room, but the janitor within me was still hyper-focused on the precision of the service. I watched as Sarah approached the guest of honor's table, a seat reserved for Prince Al Farid, the most influential venture capitalist in the global hospitality sector. The prince hadn't arrived yet, but his personal envoy, a man with the eyes of a surgical strike predator, was already inspecting the table settings. The dessert course tonight is a bespoke creation, I heard Sarah coo, her voice dripping with a false resolution of expertise. I personally directed my culinary team to focus on the mirror, paradox of flavors, the heat of the spice against the cold of the cream. It's a concept I've been developing for my new luxury brand. I wanted something that represented the glow of my own journey. The envoy didn't look impressed. He looked bored. The prince is a man of permanent foreclosure when it comes to mediocrity. Ms. Sterling. He does not care for concepts. He cares for mastery. He is coming here tonight because he was told that the architect of the Royal Pastry Kitchens was the one behind the menu. If he finds out this is just another PR stunt, your brand will be over before the coffee is served. I saw the flicker of medical shock in Sarah's eyes. She didn't know who the architect was. She truly believed that just a baker sister she had screamed at in the kitchen was a nobody she could easily replace with a title. She leaned in closer to the envoy, her voice a desperate ghost of its former confidence. I assure you, my lead baker is competent, but the vision is entirely mine. She just follows the instructions I provide. I stepped out from behind the curtain, just as the trumpet fanfare announced the prince's arrival. The room went silent. A status flip so sudden it felt like the air had been sucked out of the ballroom. The prince entered, flanked by security, but his eyes weren't on the dignitaries or the social mask. Sarah was frantically trying to adjust. He was looking for someone. He was looking for the sovereign of the kitchen. Sarah rushed forward, her hands outstretched in a gesture of glow hospitality. Your Highness, welcome. I am Sarah Sterling, the director of... The prince didn't even stop. He walked right past her, his gaze locking onto mine. The medical shock on Sarah's face was priceless. She stood frozen, her hand still reaching for a man who didn't know she existed. I stood tall, the pain in my arms, forgotten as the resolution of years of labor finally met the light. I wasn't the janitor tonight. I was the architect receiving her guest. Maya, the prince said, his voice a warm glow that carried across the silent room. He didn't bow to me because of my name. He bowed because of my craft. I heard there was an accident in the kitchen. I was told you were injured. Why are you standing here in a gown when you should be resting? I felt Sarah's gaze burning into my back, a surgical strike of pure hatred and confusion. She couldn't understand the mirror paradox unfolding before her. A baker never leaves the kitchen until the resolution is served. Your Highness, I replied, my voice steady and clear, and tonight the service is personal. I wanted to ensure that everyone here understands exactly what goes into the glow they are about to consume. I glanced back at Sarah. The permanent foreclosure on her arrogance was starting to settle in. She looked at my lace sleeves, finally noticing the faint outlines of the bandages beneath. She realized that the prince wasn't here for her vantage. He was here for the peasant she had just tried to bury in the flower. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted from a social mask of civility to a medical shock of high-tension theater. My sister Sarah was pale, her fingers twitching against the silk of her dress as she realized the vantage she had spent months building was slipping through her fingers like sand. The prince was still standing with me, his concern a surgical strike against Sarah's narrative that I was a mere janitor in her grand design. She knew she had to act. To reclaim the glow before the status flip became permanent, but her desperation made her reckless. "Your Highness, Maya is humble," Sarah said, stepping between us with a forced laugh that sounded like shattering glass. "She's so dedicated to her hobby that she often exaggerates her role. But the kitchen is a chaotic place. In fact, due to her accident earlier, the main dessert course was compromised. I've already arranged for a backup service from a more reliable executive package catering firm." I felt the medical shock of her betrayal cold and sharp in my chest. She wasn't just dismissing me anymore. She was actively trying to destroy the resolution of my work to save her own social mask. Behind her, I saw her assistant, signaling to the waitstaff to remove my hand-laminated pastries, the ones I had bled for, and replace them with generic, mass-produced cakes from a local luxury chain. "You're replacing the architect's work?" the prince asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous ghost of a whisper. "You are suggesting that the woman who designed the coronation, Feast of the Nordic Crown, is unreliable? I'm suggesting that as the lead coordinator, I must prioritize the glow of the evening," Sarah insisted, her arrogance finally overriding her common sense. She signaled a waiter to bring a tray of the replacement desserts to the prince. "Taste this, Your Highness. It is a surgical strike of modern flavor, far superior to anything a burned janitor could produce in a panic." The room went silent as the prince looked at the plate. He didn't take a bite. Instead, he looked at me, his eyes searching for a resolution. I didn't say a word. I simply stepped forward and pulled back the lace sleeves of my gown, revealing the raw red blisters that Sarah had mocked. The medical shock that rippled through the ballroom was audible. To the elite, these weren't just burns. They were the scars of a sovereign who had sacrificed her own body for the status of her art. These burns happened because I was protecting the temperature of the sugar for your signature dessert. "Your Highness," I said, my voice carrying the weight of permanent foreclosure on Sarah's career. "My sister thinks that a baker is someone who follows orders. She doesn't realize that a baker is the one who controls the flame." The prince turned his gaze back to Sarah, and the glow of the chandeliers seemed to darken around her. "You have committed a surgical strike against your own integrity. Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice cold and absolute. "You attempted to hide the architect of this evening behind a social mask of lies. And then you attempted to feed me garbage to cover your own tracks." He gestured to his envoy, who immediately stepped forward with a tablet. "The executive package of investment we discussed for your firm? It is under permanent foreclosure. I do not invest in visionaries who cannot recognize the foundation they stand on. I invest in vantage, and clearly you have none." Sarah's face went from a medical shock of white to a status flip of absolute ruin. She looked around the room, but the powerful bosses and socialites, who had been her friends moments ago, were now looking away, their eyes reflecting the mirror paradox of her downfall. She was the janitor now, left to clean up the wreckage of her own vanity. "Waitstaff," the prince commanded, his voice ringing through the hall. "Bring out the architect's original service. And clear this. Back up from my sight." I wished to taste the fire that Maya went through to welcome me. As the true desserts were brought out, the glow returned to the room, but it no longer belonged to Sarah. It centered on me. I stood there, my burns throbbing, but my spirit finally in resolution. The status flip was no longer a dream. It was the reality of the night. The room was held in a state of medical shock as the true dessert service was finally unveiled. Each plate was a surgical strike of precision, featuring a delicate sugar cage that looked like spun gold, housing a heart of dark chocolate and spiced fruit. The prince took a slow, deliberate bite, and for a moment, the glow of the entire ballroom seemed to dim as everyone waited for his resolution. When he finally looked up, his eyes weren't on the plate. They were on me, filled with a deep, professional respect that felt like a status flip for every insult I had ever endured. "This is not the work of a baker," the prince announced, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. "This is the work of the architect of flavors, the woman who revolutionized the dessert industry in Paris under the pseudonym L'Ombre. I have spent 3 years trying to find the genius who walked away from the Michelin circuit to return to her family. I didn't expect to find her covered in burns and being treated like a janitor by her own blood." The discovery hit the room like a physical wave. The social mask Sarah had been wearing for years, the one where she was the genius mogul and I was the struggling sibling, disintegrated instantly. A hush fell over the elite guests as they realized they weren't just witnessing a family spat. They were watching the permanent foreclosure of Sarah's social standing. "Paris?" Sarah stammered, her voice a thin, ragged ghost of its former self. "Maya, you said you were just taking classes. You told us you were doing freelance consulting for local cafes." "I told you what you wanted to hear, Sarah," I said, my voice assuming the calm vantage of a woman who no longer needed to hide. "You were so obsessed with your own glow that you never bothered to look at the ghost ledger of my career. You saw me in the kitchen and assumed I was a servant because that's how you've always seen people who actually work. You didn't realize that while you were faking success with social mask PR campaigns, I was being commissioned by the actual sovereigns of the world." The prince's envoy stepped forward again, holding a tablet that displayed a surgical strike of data. "We did a background check on the sterling PR firm as part of the due diligence for the investment. It seems the vantage you claimed, Mrs. Sarah, was built entirely on your sister's anonymous reputation. You've been using Maya's secret consulting fees to keep this firm afloat for 2 years. You didn't just insult her tonight. You've been parasitic to her talent while calling her a peasant." This was the mirror paradox at its most brutal. Sarah had spent the evening trying to disown my low-class work, only to have it revealed that my work was the only thing keeping her high-class life from collapsing into permanent foreclosure. The guests began to whisper, their eyes turning into surgical strike lenses that saw Sarah for exactly what she was, a fraud. "Wait," I said, turning to the prince, my resolution hardening. "There is one more thing. The surgical strike?" Sarah attempted tonight, replacing. "My work with mass-produced garbage wasn't just an insult to me. It was an insult to you." She was willing to poison your experience, just to maintain her social mask of control. The prince nodded, his face a medical shock of cold finality. "I understand. The status flip is complete. Sarah, you are barred from all future royal events. And as for your firm, I believe permanent foreclosure is too kind a word. I will ensure that every powerful boss in this room knows that your glow is nothing but stolen fire." Sarah slumped into a chair, the glow of the chandeliers reflecting in the tears she finally shed, not for me, but for herself. The janitor was finally being shown the door. The medical shock of the ballroom had not yet dissipated, but the scene was shifting from a social disaster to a surgical strike of legal and financial restructuring. My sister Sarah sat in the gilded chair like a ghost of her former self, her social mask completely shattered as the elite crowd she had worshipped began to drift away from her as if she were a contagion. The prince's envoy remained by my side, his tablet now displaying the ghost ledger that would finalize the permanent foreclosure of Sarah's stolen empire. "You don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice a ragged resolution of pure desperation as she looked up at me. "I did it for the family. I used your money to build a vantage for all of us. If the firm fails, the sterling name is dead. You're destroying your own legacy just to prove a point about a few burns?" "The sterling name was already dead, Sarah," I replied, my voice carrying the calm glow of absolute authority. "You weren't building a legacy. You were building a social mask supported by my janitor labor. You didn't use my money. You embezzled it from the consulting accounts I set up to protect our parents' retirement. You treated my talent as a ghost asset, something you could exploit while mocking the person who created it." I turned to Julian, the prince's legal attaché, who had already begun the status flip protocols. "Is the documentation ready?" "Yes, Ms. Sterling," Julian said, his voice a surgical strike of professional finality. "Since you are the primary creditor for Sterling PR, and since the prince has withdrawn all executive package support based on the fraud clause, you have the legal right to execute a permanent foreclosure. We have already frozen the firm's assets. By tomorrow morning, the vantage Sarah claims to own will be officially transferred to your new holding company, the Architects Guild." The medical shock on Sarah's face was now replaced by a realization of the mirror paradox. She had spent the evening trying to kick me out of the glow of high society, only to find herself evicted from her own life. She was no longer the powerful boss. She was the liability. Every contract she had signed, every social mask event she had hosted, was now under the direct control of the baker she had called a peasant. "You're taking my company?" Sarah gasped, her eyes darting around the room for an ally who wasn't there. You can't do that. I'm the face of the brand. The brand is a lie, Sarah, I said, leaning in so only she could hear the resolution of my words. People didn't hire you because of your face. They hired you because the ghost in the kitchen was making them the most exclusive desserts in the world. Now that the architect is stepping into the light, the face is irrelevant. You wanted me to have nothing? Well, now you get to see what that feels like. The office, the car, the apartment, all of it belongs to the architect now. The prince stepped forward, his presence a final surgical strike against her remaining dignity. A sovereign does not negotiate with parasites. Ms. Sarah, you have until dawn to vacate the Sterling premises. If my security finds you near the architect or her kitchen, the medical shock you feel now will be the least of your concerns. As Sarah was escorted out of the ballroom by the very security she had hired, I felt a strange resolution. The janitor was no longer cleaning up someone else's mess. I was clearing the path for my own glow. The status flip was total. I looked at the burns on my arms. They still hurt, but they no longer felt like scars of shame. They were the marks of a sovereign who had survived the fire to claim the throne. The resolution of my journey didn't happen under the flash of a paparazzi's camera or within the hollow glow of a socialite's ballroom. It happened 6 months later in the quiet, pressurized stillness of my own global flagship atelier. The medical shock of the burns on my arms had faded into thin, silver lines, scars that I now wore with the pride of a sovereign who had survived her own surgical strike. I was no longer the ghost hiding in the steam. I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar culinary empire, and my vantage was now undisputed. I stood by the window of my penthouse office, watching the city wake up. Below, on the giant digital billboard overlooking the square, the social mask of the old Sterling brand had been replaced by a sleek, minimalist logo. Maya Sterling, the architect of taste. The status flip was complete. I wasn't just a baker anymore. I was a power broker who decided which powerful bosses were worthy of a seat at my table. My assistant entered, handing me a ghost ledger of the morning's reports. The Paris opening was a surgical strike, ma'am. We've sold out through the next fiscal year. Also, there's a request for a resolution from your sister's new legal counsel. I glanced at a photo attached to the file. It showed Sarah in her new reality, working as a janitor, for a mid-tier catering company to pay off the permanent foreclosure debts she owed my firm. She was covered in flour, looking exhausted, finally understanding the mirror paradox of the life she had once mocked. She had wanted me to be nothing, but in the end, she was the one left with the ghost of a reputation. Tell her counsel that the resolution is simple, I said, looking at the silver scars on my arm. If she wants a recommendation, she can earn it from the bottom up. I'm a baker, after all. I know better than anyone that you can't have the glow if you aren't willing to stand the heat.